Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is George Caleb Bingham, the Missouri artist, the latest of our programs on the American experience, which features great American art through the course of time. And tonight we're going to be talking about George Caleb Bingham, one of the great American artists of the mid 1800s. He was based in Missouri. In fact, he's known as the Missouri artist, and he's known for doing a wide variety of genre type paintings, particularly his River series, and then also his election series. But he also did portraits and history paintings and various other things like that. So we're going to check his art out. A little bit about George Caleb Bingham before we begin. He was born in 1811. He passed away in 1879. He was known as the Missouri artist, and he painted the western frontier, which at that time was in Missouri. The country had not extended as far west as it later would. And he's kind of known as the painter of the western frontier. He's also a promoter of kind of this idea of the American national identity during the mid 1800s. Like, what exactly does America mean, and what's it all about? And Bingham is documenting that through his paintings. His subjects mostly known for his River series and other series he did on country elections. He did history paintings, genre scenes, and portraits. He was mostly a self-taught artist. And interestingly enough, he also was a local Missouri politician. So we'll dive a little bit more in that in just a moment. But first, we'll introduce ourselves, our panel. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I was an art history major at the University of Michigan and spent the first 2 years of my career, fortunately, working at a fabulous museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts, before transitioning off into the business world. And my favorite artist, I'll go with, how about the topic of our next set of discussions, Frederick Remington. And we also have our good friend, Patti, the pride of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, joining us tonight. Hi, Patti. How are you? Want to introduce yourself, and who's your favorite artist?
I'm doing well. It's been an interesting day, a very exciting day, thanks to you. And let's see. I've been stuck on Georgia O'Keeffe for a while. We've just been doing a lot of work on her, and she sticks for a lot of reasons.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fabulous. Well, thank you. And let's see, you saw the film last night and then this program when we did it once before. Any particular advice or recommendations you give to people as they're looking at the art of George Caleb Bingham?
Well, as I had mentioned last night, he was a contemporary of Mark Twain, a little bit earlier, but they overlapped. He was born within 40 years of when America became America as opposed to being a colony of England. So I was there was an image sort of came to me last night. So if you think of the Eastern Seaboard, where the 13 original colonies were, the whole focus of that history is eastward toward Britain and Europe. And suddenly, especially once Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase, you had an American identity that was now looking westward as opposed to eastward. And both Twain and Bingham kind of established that identity in a lot of ways. And we still look back on both of them. I think I had said last night, like Bingham could have been an illustrator for Mark Twain. They were that close in terms of a lot of their perceptions about the developing country, and this particular part of the country as well. What they both started. Um, but yeah, it's like almost like a chapter. If you were to look at the map of the United States, you could almost divide it into segments moving westward. Other than, of course, California had a head start with the Spanish settlement, but it just I don't know why that image sort of came to me, but it really is a very valuable. He offers a lot of insight as to how America saw itself and how it became the America it was becoming.
Okay. Well, excellent. I like that. Looking west instead of east. Thank you. I appreciate that. And we also have our good friend Brad joining us. Brad's the pride of Falling Waters, West Virginia. Hi, Brad. You want to introduce yourself, and who's your favorite artist?
Sure. Well, I'm Brad. You know where I'm from now. Uh, my favorite
Where
artist
is Falling Waters, West Virginia, for people that might
is
not be familiar
it's
with that geography?
Eastern West Virginia, right It's almost metropolitan DC, not quite. It's a little too far to be metropolitan DC, but it's maybe 70 miles from DC. So it's the very eastern part of West Virginia.
Okay. And then do you have a favorite artist?
Yes, I do. I would have to say Andrew Wyeth at this point.
Oh, I like Andrew Wyeth. I actually like the whole Wyeth family.
Yeah, the family, but if I have to pick one.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate that. And I also have my good friend Harry joining us. Hi, Harry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Harry, I can't remember what exact city you live in Northern Virginia, so we'll just call you the pride of Northern Virginia. How's this? And you want to introduce yourself and who's your favorite artist? And oh,
That's
by the
fine.
way, Harry and I have been friends for 10 and a half years. How about that?
How about that? I'm actually in Sterling, which is about 20 miles west of Washington, D.C., near Dulles Airport. And I'm gonna say the last tour I did last month was at the Portrait Gallery, and the two artists whose paintings are part of that tour are Eastman Johnson and Winslow Homer. And I was thinking again about their work because I was able to show other people. That was a tour on Civil War era painting. So,
Oh, that's awesome. We did a program on Winslow Homer a while back. It's on our YouTube channel. Eastman Johnson, not as well known. I like him a lot too. Great kind of Civil War era painter. And he actually lived in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. So kudos to you for introducing people more to that. Do you have any, just out of curiosity, any upcoming tours you're going to be doing in Washington, D.C.?
well, I don't think I'm going to get to anything this month. I have two potential tours for August, but it depends on my schedule and the weather. Um, but I could potentially do a Watergate tour because August is the month that President Nixon resigned. So that's, sort of connected. And also the burning of Washington in 1814 by the British took place at the end of August. So those are two potential tours for the month of August.
Oh, that's awesome, Harry. I hope you host both of those, or at least one. That's awesome. Thank you so much for being here. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So this is a whole series of programs we've been doing on American art and American artists, and it's part of what we'd call, say, the quote unquote American experience. And what I mean by that is I really like art and I really like history, and I like how the two are interconnected with one another. So, for instance, in America during this time, you have artists that are visually documenting and recording what's going on in American history so that people like us in 2025 can look back and see what was happening. And then also, too, you have artists really inspiring and influencing American popular culture. So you really see both of those things with the artwork we're going to be looking at tonight, George Caleb Bingham. So something for you to keep in mind. And Bingham, a little bit of biographical information for him before we start looking at his art. He was actually born in the Shenandoah Valley, a place where I used to live many, many years ago, and in Augusta County. And he was born in 1811. And then when he was a young boy, his family moved from Virginia to Missouri, kind of like what Patti was talking about a little bit earlier, where you have this thought where instead of looking towards the east, towards Europe, people are looking towards the west in all this land of opportunity. And interestingly enough, if you go back to, okay, so Bingham's family moves to Missouri in 1819. That wasn't long after the Lewis and Clark expedition. It had only ended 13 years earlier. So that's really not that long ago. And so I think maybe for a lot of people, when they think of Missouri, they think of kind of middle America, and the West, so to speak, is beyond that. But that is true, but that wasn't the case at this point in time in the early 1800s. This was the West, and this was kind of as far out as the United States went. And in fact, when the family moved to Missouri, it wasn't even a state yet. They moved there in 1819, and Missouri didn't become a state until 1821. So there's Missouri right there on the map, formerly part of the Missouri Territory. And then just kind of a quick historical context overview. Missouri's a big state. A lot of people live there. It's got two big metropolitan areas with St. Louis and Kansas City. It was a very different type of place when the Bingham family moved there. So they arrive again in 1819. There was really only about 60-some thousand people living in the whole state. That would be the size of a city now. They didn't get statehood until 1821. Missouri's the 24th state. And then Bingham's art career begins in 1834. That's kind of noteworthy because he's trying to support himself as an artist in a state that doesn't really have a lot of people. It's hard to become an artist in any type of environment geographically, but even more so if there's just not a lot of people available. But he's able to carve out a career. And how his art career begins, this is a really interesting story. There was an American portrait painter by the name of Chester Harding. He was born in 1792, and he just happens to be traveling through Missouri one day, and he stays at a boarding house that just happened to be owned by George Caleb Bingham's family. And so this is taking place in 1820. That's a self-portrait of Harding on the left. And Harding is doing a portrait of Daniel Boone at this point in time. Daniel Boone was in the final months of his life. Harding ends up doing a painted portrait of him. Of course, this is before photography. And so he's doing this depiction of this great American. He just so happens to be painting it at the boarding house. Now, Boone wasn't actually there at the time. He did kind of the rough work earlier, and he's kind of finishing things up. But that being said, a young George Caleb Bingham got to see this, and it really kind of sparks his interest in art. So kind of an unusual start for his artistic career. Bingham decides he wants to be an artist. So that's what he ends up doing. We'll go look at his artworks, and we'll do it mostly like a chronological order, just so you can see how things change and develop and evolve over time. And Bingham starts his career as a portrait painter. And one of the first portraits he did was a self-portrait picture of himself. This is when he was only 23 or 24 years old. He had some other jobs that he was doing before he became a full-time artist. He was an apprentice, like cabinet maker, and I don't know, was involved in like different types of endeavors while he was trying to support himself as an artist early on. And he actually ends up making 4 self-portraits. This is the first of those 4, and he makes approximately 500 self-portraits that we know of during his career. So he was very prolific in that regard. And again, noteworthy that he's able to do this while not living in, say, New York City or someplace like that where they have more people available. And then here is the museum card for this painting. The fine handling of line and paint in this self-portrait are remarkable achievements for a young 23-year-old artist. Missourian George Caleb Bingham had no formal training or even substantial exposure to fine art at this point in his career. He presents himself in a straightforward style as one of the many members of the growing middle class in Missouri, then considered the country's far west. And there's Bingham, really talented portrait, especially for such early point in his career. And then let's look at some of these other portraits that he did. One of the things that's really important for an artist is to get commissions. And he ends up meeting a guy by the name of James Rollins, who not only becomes friends with him, he becomes an important patron for Bingham's. And he introduces him to a lot of other well-known, wealthy, prominent people in the area. And then Bingham ends up getting a lot of commissions from these so-called friends of Rollins. But he paints Rollins several times during their lives together. Here is a portrait that he did of him in 1834. So a very important friend and patron for networking. And so again, at this point in time, he's kind of traveling around central Missouri, doing portraits of different individuals, sometimes families, like a married couple. So this is a portrait of a husband who was a merchant. And then here is a companion portrait of his wife, done in the same year, 1835. Now, this is an era before photography has really gotten going, back in 1835. And a lot of times what people would do in this era is they would get portraits made not only to kind of preserve the memory of themselves, but kind of also to show off their wealth. So usually what people do at this point in time in history is they'd get these paintings made, these oil paintings, and they'd hang him in their parlor. And then when people would come over to visit them, they could see him. And if you saw this on the wall, it was kind of like a status symbol to a certain degree, because you'd have to have a fair amount of money to be able to hire a painter to do your portrait. And it also kind of shows off kind of like a certain level of sophistication. Like, oh yeah, I hang out with artists and I'm having my oil portrait done, type of thing. And so that's kind of the dual purpose of these, is kind of one, to preserve the people's image, but also to kind of show off their wealth and status and intelligence and all that kind of stuff. So again, here's some more examples of portraits. This was a judge from Columbia, Missouri. Here's the judge's wife. Here they are side by side. I love looking at these fashions from people back in the day. Patti will note that they don't have the shoulder pads just yet. That's coming century and a half later. But anyway, the judge and his wife. And then he does get a little bit more advanced in terms of like his portraiture, making ones that look more complex. This one is actually an interesting one. I've seen this up close. It actually is in the State Department in Washington, D.C., you know, like the Department of State, the State Department, the diplomatic group of the United States government. They have a building, or an area of the building, called the Diplomatic Reception Rooms. This painting hangs in there. And then this is an interesting one. This one's not very well known, I think partially because it's not in a museum, it's in a private collection. So I don't have a great photo of this one because it's not in a particular museum collection. But that being said, I really like this painting a lot. It's called Family Life on the Frontier. It was made sometime before 1840. And it kind of looks like, you know, the depiction of, hey, this is what family life in middle America was like at this point in time, the people reading by candlelight and the fireplace and all this kind of stuff. So let me stop there for a moment and see if our distinguished panelists, Harry, Patti, and Brad, have any thoughts on either the portraits or this painting or George Caleb Bingham up until now. So any of the three of you have anything you want to chime in with?
One thing I like about this one is that it isn't portraying a middle class. It's portraying the grit of what this settlement of this new area was about. This, you can see it's very dark. There's not a lot of windows. It's not heavily furnished. So he's including, that's what I mean by the storytelling aspect of it. It's like it's building an image of who these people were.
Oh, that's a great point, Patti. Thanks for mentioning that. Because, yeah, I mean, if you look at these previous people he's depicting, I mean, these people are kind of the high society people of central Missouri. And these are not the same people that are being depicted. This is a little bit harder of a life than what we would have seen, kind of the finery in the previous portraits.
But they certainly have an incredibly bright light on the table.
Yeah, I know. I was wondering what the source of that was. I didn't know. I didn't know like candles and oil lamps burn that bright. Maybe he's got the flashlight on his iPhone feature turned on.
The first electric
LED lights.
What about Harry? Any thoughts on the Bingham paintings up until now?
Well, just on his early life, you know, Patti mentioned Mark Twain, who's a little bit younger. The other contemporary of theirs is Abraham Lincoln. And,
Yes.
you know, he's born in Kentucky and has very little formal education. I think Twain left school in the 5th grade or something, and yet became a fabulous writer. And here we have a painter who, you know, is really self-taught. I mean, he goes to Europe later in life after, you know, he established himself as an artist to you know, understand the history of painting, but he really has no background except looking at other, you know, frontier artists who he's taking his cues from. And I think that's, you know, it's sort of an interesting story from that era, right? Where you had people who ended up doing accomplishing really amazing things with very little formal training.
Oh yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned Abraham Lincoln because this painting actually reminds me of Abraham Lincoln. Although Lincoln's upbringing, I think, was much let's see, poor or not as. I mean, these people aren't rich, but Lincoln was really, really poor when he was growing up. But for some reason, this painting does always remind me of Abraham Lincoln. So kind of funny that you mentioned that, Harry.
Yeah, I like that. I like that you made that connection too. And they do have a great deal in common as Americans.
Oh yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. All right, well, let's continue on. Let's see. So here's another portrait. This was a doctor, friend of his. And you'll notice, okay, so um, the earlier portraits that we saw of Bingham started in like 1834. This is 10 years later. And you can see he's pretty advanced in terms of his skill, especially for someone that never really had any formal training. As Harry mentioned, he didn't really see a lot of other. I mean, it's not like he can walk down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and go look at, Van Gogh and Monet paintings and stuff. He's kind of looking at art from studying like magazines and prints and stuff like that. So pretty extraordinary development in that regard. And then somewhat early on in his life, Bingham ends up going to Washington, D.C. He wants to be a professional artist, or he is a professional artist. It requires a certain amount of level of say sophistication and economic resources to be able to have your painted portrait done. And he's thinking, you know what, there's a lot of prominent wealthy people in Washington, D.C. So if I want to be a portrait painter, that's probably a lot better place to be than Central Missouri. So he ends up moving to Washington, D.C. And he actually does get a lot of commissions from, say, famous people, at least historically prominent people. So he does a portrait of John Quincy Adams. He did this one initially in 1844, and then Adams passed away in 1848. And Adams was greatly admired in the mid 1800s as like a man of virtue. After he lost the presidency, he was in Congress, was very well respected. And when he passed away, there was a big interest in his life. And so Caleb Bingham made essentially a copy of an earlier portrait he did. And then this is Daniel Webster, important politician from the mid 1800s from Massachusetts. And so Bingham ends up living in Washington, D.C. for 4 years, interestingly enough. So he wasn't always in Missouri. And then here's an interesting portrait. This was a congressman and future governor from Missouri. This one, a little bit more advanced. It's a full portrait. He's not just showing the person's face and their like upper torso. He's got like the full body with like some background stuff. So kind of interesting development there. And then this is the picture of his first wife. Bingham ended up being married 3 times, which maybe that's not uncommon today. That actually wasn't that uncommon back then, just because people's spouses tend to not live a long time, or people just in general didn't live a long time. And if you were married, it wasn't uncommon for your spouse to pass away. And so people would frequently remarry or remarried more than once. So this was his first wife, Sarah Elizabeth. They ended up marrying in 1836. Now, interestingly enough, with this portrait, his son is depicted here, although his son passed away the year prior. And so the thought is maybe this was like a memorial picture to his son, and then also to his first wife, which he included in there. And then this is also his first wife. Now, again, notice this is a portrait of her, although it's not officially titled as a portrait, but it's a little bit more advanced than some of the previous things that we've seen. And this was part of his Washington, D.C. years. And she's reading a book, and it looks like the book wasn't that exciting. So I think it might have been an accounting book, because I read these and they put me to sleep every time also. So, or it would have been something else. Who knows? But anyway, a really nice portrait, a touching portrait of his wife. And then here's a marriage portrait. This young lady was getting married. It's frequent during this era, before photography becomes prominent, for people to have a painted portrait of themselves, either right after they got engaged or right after they got married. That was the case here. And again, you can see the talent of his abilities as a portrait painter. So next we'll talk about this river series. But before we do that, any final thoughts on the portraits from our panel of guests?
I thought the one he did of the Missouri politician, the placement was interesting because not only is it a full length portrait of the man, but he dwarfs the Capitol building behind him. It's just an
Oh yeah.
interesting setup.
Yeah, that's kind of a not uncommon thing from this era, just because like now, if you were taking like a selfie or something, yeah, you'd get real close and it'd be prominent in the background. But it was kind of almost like, oh, he's including that in here just so you know that this guy's a politician. But yeah, that is an interesting observation because you do frequently see that in like paintings from this era.
Interesting.
Anything else?
I was just going to mention the painting of the woman in the white gown in the chair. You know, he has obviously traveled some now and seen other artists and other paintings, because you know a lot of the early portraits are, you know, what you might expect, you know, painting in the frontier towns in the West. But this is a painting where an artist has either seen or is seen other artists that are looking at European paintings, right?
Yeah, like if you contrast these two, which I like
Yeah,
these
right.
portraits.
Like
So
these
these are
portraits are very,
nice.
you know, he's doing very lifelike, and you know, not much of a background, dark clothing or the blue scarf, you know, what the people would actually be wearing. Whereas in that portrait, you know, he's got the curtain, there's a little column, and there's, you know, some fabric on the chair, and the beautiful folds in her dress. He has seen either European paintings or Americans who are working on European painting models, because this is a much more sophisticated, sort of, you know, eastward looking sort of image.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Harry,
Excellent. Yeah.
that
If you look at the previous couple, that almost the thought that keeps coming into my mind is homespun. That woman and man that you showed in the previous slide, the
yeah, these
homespun.
two. Uh-huh.
Yeah, sort of like that rough fabric people would make.
Oh yeah, and then even the portrait of himself, the self-portrait. I mean, this is really nicely done too. But like it's like Harry's bringing up, the other ones are like a whole different dimension.
Exactly. Nice.
Brad, what about you? Any thoughts on the portraits before we continue on? All right. Well, let's go to the River series. So this is what Bingham is most well known for. He made these paintings and they were super popular. He ended up making a lot of money from selling these. In business or in marketing, they have this concept called like the big idea, where you think of something and it ends up being hugely successful. So this was his big idea. No one had really done anything like this before. He ends up making these river paintings, and 100 and some years later, we're still talking about these. So let's discuss this. So Bingham's home is in north central Missouri. Here's Kansas City, here's St. Louis, and he's living though right along the Missouri River, which I always feel like the Missouri River doesn't get its due credit. Everybody in America has heard of the Mississippi River, but the Missouri River is also very important. And Bingham's home is in central Missouri. You can actually visit it. It's a museum open to the public. It's part of the Arrow Rock State Historic Park. He lived there from 1837 to 1845. If you get a chance, you should go visit this site. Not only can you learn about Bingham, but how people lived in the mid 1800s in Missouri. And this was actually a pretty nice home. It's got bricks and windows and things like that. So he was doing fairly well selling his portraits at this point in time. And if you visit this site, they have a lot of really cool living history programs. So you can get a sense of what it would have been like to live in this era at this point in time. And then again, when people think of the American West, they think of cowboys and Indians and soldiers and all this stuff. And that is a real thing, but that's like a couple of generations later. That's like after the Civil War, like 1870s, 1880s. we're talking about the 1830s and 1840s. So like Frederick Remington, who's going to be featuring in early September, his artwork is, I think, kind of synonymous today with the American West, but that's further west and that's like a few decades later. So we're not quite there yet. At this point in time, this is the American West, because this is really as far as at least the United States extends. Of course, there's indigenous people that are living further west, and even within some of these areas where Bingham is at. But that being said, this is kind of the end of the United States where he's at this point in time. And he ends up making this painting, which is one of his more famous works. It's called Fur Traders Descending the Missouri. It's from 1845. It's part of his River series, where he's depicting people living and working along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. This is a really iconic painting. If you had to make a list of famous American paintings that have been created through the course of time, I can guarantee you that this one would be on that list. And interestingly enough, this painting was actually lost for several years and was rediscovered in the early 1900s by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And here it is. And you have these two figures, and they're in this dugout canoe, and they're traveling along a river, and they have some type of black animal that no one is quite sure what that is, if it's a cat or a raccoon or who knows what. Let's see. So I'm going to play a short video, a video clip of the Bingham painting, this one being rediscovered. So it was discovered by a employee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I'm going to play a clip from this video, but I have to pause our recording because I don't want to get into trouble with the copyright police. So let me pause this for a second. Okay, so this painting was lost for a while, just kind of floating around, and ended up in this store. The Met buys it, and there's actually two versions of the painting. There's one at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which was done in 1845. There's another version, similar but a little bit different, at the Detroit Institute of Arts, my former employer, which was made in 1851. And you're familiar with this concept where they make a movie and it's really successful, so they end up doing a sequel. Well, artists do the same thing. They have a successful painting that's popular, and they frequently will make other versions of the painting later on down the road. That's what Bingham ends up doing here. And so this is, again, Fur Traders Descending the Missouri. So 1845. It's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And then here's one at the Detroit Institute of Art. It's called The Trapper's Return from 1851. So here's the New York version. Here's the DIA version, and here they are side by side. Now, a few things to point out about this. First of all, by the time Bingham paints these works, this kind of way of life had really disappeared. This was kind of a scene that he remembered more from his childhood, where he'd see these fur trappers descending the river. This wasn't really a thing that was going on at this point in time, but that's fine. It doesn't need to be exactly in the historical moment for it to be important work. But the fur trade does play a really important part of the history of the American West. It's really kind of a vanishing way of life, though, at this point in time. And a lot of art historians have really commented on the fact that this is a great example of what's known as Luminism, where there's a landscape that's beautifully lit, captured in a painting.
Robert, can I interrupt you a second?
Yes, of course, always.
It seems to me that we're seeing an image of the movie stopped, not any of the others that you've been talking about.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Oh, that's weird. Well, here, let me do this. Let me stop that. Let me start up. Thanks, Brad. I appreciate that. But yeah, feel free to chime in as always. Hold on for 1 second. I think we're back to having those ghosts from the Live Aid concert causing us technical problems. Okay, here it goes. Let's see. Well, let me go back a second in case we missed this. All right, so here's the one that's in New York, the Met. Here's the one that's in Detroit. And here's the two side by side. Again, this was kind of a way of life that would pretty much mostly disappeared by the time Bingham paints this, but that's okay. And then here is the museum info card for this painting at the museum in Detroit. Raised in central Missouri, Bingham found the most enduring subjects of his art in the trappers and boatmen who populated his state's great rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi, combining the elements of water, foliage, hazy morning light, rivermen, and their simple crafts. He created a sequence known today as the river paintings. He didn't call it that. That's what art historians categorized it later on. After his passing, The Trapper's Return is generally considered one of the artist's finest works. The picture presents a dugout canoe moving slowly downstream with an old French trader paddling in the stern and his son amidships with an animal on the bow. And again, the Mississippi River is so much more well known in the United States. But that being said, the Missouri River is also extremely important. See, it's extremely long, 2,341 miles. Here's the two paintings side by side. Oops. There's always been a big debate on what this animal is on the left, and there is no one that knows 100% for sure. People, oh, it's a cat, it's a raccoon, it's a who knows what, but I really don't want to get hung up on what the animal is, because actually the more important part is the actual two traders themselves. So you have this kind of older gentleman looking very stern. He's paddling the canoe. This is probably either supplies that they need for their trip, or probably more likely furs. And this is supposedly his son. And they're traveling down the river. They've probably traded for furs with Native Americans, and they're taking these or transporting them to, say, United States American citizen encampments, and they'll trade them for money and things like that. Let's see. Let's check in with Harry, Patti, and Brad. Any thoughts on the Trapper's Return set of paintings?
One thing I always think of when you show either of these in close-up is that without saying anything about it, but between the clothing of the older gentleman and the just the general look of the younger one, the suggestion is here of the interaction between early Americans and Native Americans. It's subtle, though. I mean, I only think about it when I'm looking at it and contemplating it.
Oh yeah,
It's
definitely.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, definitely. I mean, that his the younger person is thought to be a mixed race individual between the trapper and the indigenous woman, and that was a common thing because it kind of strengthened the bonds between these fur traders and the indigenous peoples. So yeah, it's more subtle kind of
It's
connection.
unsaid, yeah, but it's implied.
Yeah,
Exactly.
implied, right? Exactly. So that's cool. What about you, Brad, Harry? Any thoughts on this set?
Well, actually, the New York painting, his original title was French Trader Dash Half-Breed Son.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so it wasn't subtle in the title.
Yeah,
Um,
they didn't think that was politically correct, and so at some point in time the title got
yeah,
changed.
the American art, or the museum that bought it actually changed the title before
Mhm.
exhibiting it, thinking that that would be less controversial. But um, so yeah, I mean, the other interesting thing about the painting itself is that it's kind of we would call it a genre painting, but it's sort of a combination of portrait and landscape, right?
Yes.
Because the figures are looking right at us, right? It's not like we're observing two guys, rowing down the river, right? We're looking at two guys who stopped their boat to look at us,
Mhm.
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, they definitely noticed
Or
this.
we called out to them and said, "Hey," you know,
And,
uh, and they stopped and looked right at us,
and
right?
Mhm.
even their pet is looking right at us.
Hey,
Yeah.
what's that animal?
How far to Montana?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's a little bit different than just, observing a landscape, right?
Mhm.
It's almost like we as the observers are interacting with the men on the boat. And you know, it gives it kind of an intimate quality, like, hey, we're right there with them on the river.
Yeah, imagine how different it would be if neither of the two figures were looking at us. If they like the guy was looking straight ahead and the younger boy or young man was looking at him or looking the other way or something, it would be a very different type of painting.
Yeah, you can't not look at, especially the first one. They're very similar, but the first one, Harry's right. It just grabs you. It's like you have to look back because you're being looked at.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's continue on.
Yeah, and that I was just gonna say that New York, that landscape, you know, it's so just the mist and you know, you can't quite make out the details. It looks like an island in the river. It's quite beautiful.
mhm.
Very,
Oh yeah,
mhm.
yeah. The landscaping itself is really nice, which is funny because he's not known as a landscape painter, although he did paint some um, landscapes. All right, let's continue on. This is perhaps another one of his most famous paintings, The Jolly Flatboatman. And this is not far from where Harry and Brad are. It's at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's painted in 1846. It's another example of a genre painting. We'll explain what exactly that term means in just a minute. And this series of art programs you do about American artists, it really tends to kind of uncover some of the facts of the American experience. And so, in particular, one of the things that really benefited the United States during the mid 1800s and even later was having this river system, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, etc. And this painting has an interesting connection to Abraham Lincoln. We'll be talking about him again. Music, dancing, relaxing, these men are enjoying themselves as they navigate a flatboat down what is likely the Missouri River, the longest river in North America. In the early 1800s, goods and people moved via a network of waterways across the country. Flatboats were rectangular vessels designed to carry large loads of cargo. George Caleb Bingham, a self taught artist, lived near the Missouri River and depicted the culture of trappers and boaters in his paintings. And here's the work, full view. So it's a bunch of guys. They're on this flatboat. They're going down the river. Some of them are playing music, and one of the guys is dancing. Here's a close up. And notice some of the figures appear to be looking at us again, although some of the others are oblivious to us. And then I thought you might be wondering, what kind of music did people listen to at this point in time? So let me stop the video or pause the video for a second so I don't get into copyright trouble. And I'll play a song that was really popular during this point in time in history. And it's one that you may have heard of before. So, and then we've been talking about genre paintings. And what exactly does that mean? Genre painting is an art form that depicts aspects of everyday life by portraying ordinary people engaged in common activities. One classic definition of a genre scene is that it shows figures to whom no identity can be attached, either individually or collectively, thus distinguishing it from history paintings and portraits. So, for instance, we don't know who any of these guys are in this painting, and Bingham created many genre paintings during his career. So we'll use that term throughout our program. So what?
One of the
Oh,
points
go
that
ahead.
was filmed last night was that he traveled around with costume type equipment, clothing, and things so that he could dress people up to paint these genres.
Oh yeah, he can kind of modify him if he's not completely, if they don't quite fit the character that he's looking for. That's a great point. Let's see. And then what kind of transportation options did people have in an era before railroads and automobiles? Well, you could walk, you could ride a horse, you could push a cart, you could use this wagon that they have at the Smithsonian American History Museum. And so this was a very slow way of transporting stuff and very laborious, and you can only take so much at a time. And you need animals to haul this stuff. A lot quicker, efficient way to do things would be to use the river. Now, they didn't have steam power at this point in time, but they could use the current of the river or try and steer a boat and things like that. So what you have is in these northern areas, they're loading up these flatboats with stuff, and they're basically drifting them down the river to points south. And sometimes they would go all the way to New Orleans. And the Mississippi and Missouri River economics really plays a huge role in the economic development of the United States, because it really increased the amount of commerce and trade and economic activity and things like that. Really has a big impact on the development and economic growth of the United States. And so some of these boats were pretty basic. I've read accounts where one or two guys working for a while could put one of these together. And then if some of them would be a little bit more advanced, you could even take horses with you. Of course, you would pack up some food. So oftentimes they were loading up like manufactured goods or agricultural products and things like that. And they're sending them down the river as far as trading goes. This one's pretty advanced. It actually has an extra canoe along with it. And then here's another one. Now they do have steamers eventually coming into the mix, but those are only carrying so much stuff. So this was a more economical way to ship stuff down the river. And then, of course, what they would do once they got to the end of the river, they would just ditch the boat that usually would be torn apart, and the wood would be used for something else. And the guys would make their way back up north with their cash in hand. And then here's a map of the US. So the Missouri River is right here. The Mississippi is here. The Ohio River is here. Arkansas River. There's many other rivers. Just imagine all this flow of people and goods working their way south to New Orleans. And from there, you could stay in New Orleans, or the stuff, or the people could go all the way to New York or Europe or wherever. So it really just opens up a lot of opportunities for people. And interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln has a connection to this point in time. So why were Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery more progressive than those of many other Northerners? Well, it's because he actually was a flatboatman on two different occasions. Lincoln left Illinois and traveled by flatboat. So Abraham Lincoln served as a flatboatman twice, in 1828 and 1831, when he was 19 and 22. It was on these journeys that he first witnessed slavery. And in New Orleans, he also saw a slave auction firsthand, which had a significant impact on his views on slavery. Lincoln would later recall those journeys as essential in shaping his personal view on slavery and the slave trade. This was actually a print that was made kind of talking about the life of Abraham Lincoln. So this is Lincoln right here. And then this is a young woman who's these creepy guys are feeling her body, and she's being auctioned off. So you can kind of see where that's going. And then as far as the flatboat timeline, the War of 1812 ends in 1815. In 1814, 598 flatboats arrived in New Orleans. They were keeping track of this. Lincoln makes his first flatboat trip in 1828. He makes a second one in 1831. Bingham paints his painting, Jolly Flatboatman, in 1846. Here was the peak of the flatboat trade this year, 1847, 2,900 or 2,792 flatboats arrive in New Orleans. That's a huge amount. That's many coming every single day and week and month. And then it kind of died off before the Civil War. It was replaced more like by steamboats and stuff when the Civil War starts.
And just one note too, Twain's one of his most controversial but well-known novels, Huck Finn, really harkens back to this very period in terms of river traffic, as they're going down the river on essentially a flatboat of some sort.
Oh yeah, thanks, Patty. Let's see, and then okay, and then all right. So if you look at the United States, to show you the economic impact that the river had on and commerce, river trade and stuff on the United States, 1850. The 7 biggest cities in the United States. Of course, you got the top 4: New York, Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia, are on the East Coast. They were around for a long time. They were established. The next 3 are all these central portion of the United States cities that are along the river. So New Orleans, we already talked about that. Cincinnati is along the Ohio River, and St. Louis, the Missouri and the Mississippi. So you can see, wow, this is where all the people are moving to. There's jobs and things going on here. So it really drives a lot of the economic activity in the United States. And then this is interesting. This is the population of St. Louis and the population of New Orleans from 1820 to 1860. And look at how in a matter of 40 years, the population in St. Louis explodes. It goes from 2,000 people to 160,000. New Orleans goes from 27,000 to 169,000. Now, the rest of the area is not growing anywhere near that rate, but these are boom towns. And reason being is because of all the river traffic that's taking place. And the flatboatman is part of that. And if you actually travel this area, you can still see they have historical mock-ups of what these boats were like. They're pretty interesting to go on and visit. Different museums and historical organizations have these. So here's a smaller one. But anyway, getting back to this, the Jolly Flatboatman ended up being a really popular print that Bingham sold. So a common way for people to have art in their home is they would take a famous painting and they would make these color prints of it, and they could sell them for, you know, a modest amount of money. And then people could hang them in their homes or look at them or whatever. So this Jolly Flatboatman was really kind of designed for like the market back east, so to speak. And it would give people out in the East Coast, like New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia, kind of a sense of what it would be like to be, quote unquote, out west, because this is before color photography and television and the internet and all that stuff. And so these paintings and depictions by artists like Bingham is really the only way that people can get a sense of what life is like out in this part of the country. So here's the Jolly Flatboatman again. You have these guys, they're looks like they're taking a break. They did need a lot of labor for the boats to push it down the river, but once it was going, it was somewhat relatively easy to get it going. You just had to kind of be on the lookout for rocks and hazards and stuff like that. So these guys are taking a break, enjoying some music and dancing. It's our central figure here. Bingham made a number of sketches. This is what Patti was referring to earlier. He'd encounter people, make drawings of them. He's not actually making the painting out on the river. He's making drawings and sketches, and then later on he'd go back to his studio and make the finished painting there. Here's a close-up of some of the figures. Other side, our dancer. And then down the bottom, this is where they're storing all the stuff that they're transporting south. So again, it was usually manufactured goods, agricultural items, anything that they could sell for a profit or for more money than was readily available where they were at. And there you have it. Brad, Patti, and Harry, any thoughts on the Jolly Flatboatman?
No, just that persistent idea that he is inventing the image of middle America, which at that time was the West. But I'm saying these visions are what people think of, I think, in terms of middle America.
Oh yeah, we talked about that before. We're like, you know, these artists are kind of documenting what's going on out here. And the reason why we have these visions or images of this time frame in this era is because artists like Bingham making these great paintings.
Yeah, it's just so iconic.
Well, what about you, Brad and Harry?
You get the feeling from this that all work is not, work can be fun as well as work. And,
Oh yeah.
and that isn't necessarily shown in art usually. So
Well,
it's kind of a unique thing.
That is a neat point. I never thought about that, but yeah, you're right. It's usually work is work and play is play, and they don't intermingle. Unless you're someone like Tina Turner and Mick Jagger.
Well, it is that sense of adventure. Go west, young man, you know, because there's a life out here. Even back then, they probably thought that the East Coast was too crowded.
Oh yeah, well imagine people, you know, they're back east in the city and it's, you know, crowded and dirty and, you know, blah blah blah. And then you see these images like, oh wow, that looks, you know, fun and exciting and adventure and there's opportunity. I think I'll go out there and do that. So, you know, if something had to prompt all these masses of people to move, you know, if you go back to the chart that had the population growth, I mean, somehow all these people got the idea to move to these places in an era before the television and internet. And so how are they, you know, making those decisions? And you have to believe that paintings like this probably influenced them. What about you, Harry? Any thoughts on the, oh, go ahead, Patti.
No, I was just going to say, and it's an ingrained part of the American psyche and character, that movement that, you can always leave and go somewhere else. I think it's a part of our character that we don't really think about a lot.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that is also an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, hey, whatever. You get divorced, you can move somewhere else. You lose your job, you can pack your bags and go find a new one some other city if you want. What about you, Harry? Any thoughts on the Jolly Flatboat?
Yeah, just yeah, I think somebody was asking about the ski, that below where the level that they're on, he does provide some detail. You see the bedrolls rolled up and a shirt hanging up, and it looks like a raccoon skin hanging there. He tries to provide details to give you the impression that he really saw it, right?
Hmm.
That this is a real scene, and not just something that is totally made up. And somebody mentioned in the comments that he uses this triangular formation, right? Of the men on the boat. And when you see a lot, and of course, this is something that artists have been doing going back to classical times, right? Using this kind of a form to give structure to a particular painting. And when you look at a lot of Bingham's paintings of group scenes, you see a very similar idea that he uses in a lot of them.
Oh yeah, that was Pamela. Shout out to her for bringing up the triangular composition. So if you're not familiar with that, okay, here's the top of the triangle. Here's the corner. Here's the other corner. And this is a technique that artists use. As Harry mentioned, it's been around for a long time, but it just kind of makes the artwork kind of more visually appealing. It kind of solidifies the figures and things like that. So it's a frequent art technique. So shout out to Pamela for interjecting that. Thanks, appreciate that. Let's see. So he does a whole series of these paintings, Life Along the Missouri River. Here's another one at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, Boatman on the Missouri from 1846. Again, part of the River series. This is a group of individuals that are working. They don't look like they're having quite as much fun as the last group of guys, but these were called wood hawks. And what they do, the steamships were going up and down the river, and they needed wood to operate the ship for fires and things like that. Well, it's not like the steamship can go send out a group of guys on their own to go chop down trees. So they would essentially buy wood from these locals that would cut it down, put it on these little boats, take them out to the steamers, and then sell them, and then kind of continue on their way. So interesting depiction here. And here's a close up.
Plus, a smaller boat, so they're probably less alcohol and food service.
Yeah, right, exactly. Interesting, the guy's got a top hat on the left. And then here's another one. This is called the wood boat. Similar thing. They loading up wood to take it out to the steamers, part of the wood hawks of the River series.
And that's also part of that American spirit too. This is an invention. You invented work to meet the conditions that you were living in, and there was this improvisational quality to the development of America in general, I think.
Yeah, I mean it's very entrepreneurial. Hey, my job is I'm going to start a business. I'm going to cut down trees and chop them up into logs and put them on this little boat and take them out to the steamers and sell them, and then repeat the process. So very entrepreneurial spirit in that regard. Thanks, Patty. Appreciate you mentioning that. So again, just all this commerce and trade and jobs and stuff that come out of the river, the activity, and Bingham depicting that through his paintings. And it's fortunate that he did, because hey, if it wasn't for this, the photography wasn't established at this point in time, so we wouldn't have these types of images. Here's another one called Lighter Relieving a Steamboat Aground. So what this boat is doing is, this one off in the distance is run aground, which means it needs to be lightened, or they have to lighten the load of the boat that ran aground, so that it'll be freed from whatever's it got stuck in. And so these guys would go out and basically unload stuff off the boat temporarily. And then once it got freed, they'd turn around and put the stuff back on. This is interesting because This painting is actually in the White House, and it was a request from Lady Bird Johnson, First Lady Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of Lyndon Johnson. George Caleb Bingham was one of her favorite artists, and she really wanted a painting of his to be in the White House collection. So she organized that. And so the occupants of the White House can go check out Bingham's work. Notice this
And
guy.
she was
What's that?
East Texas. She was East Texas,
Yeah, and
right?
she's from Texas, but she really admired Bingham's
No, I'm
artwork. I
talking
mean,
East Texas though. So she would have been very aware of this culture that developed that whole area.
mhm. Let's see, notice this guy. He's got a hole in his sleeve. So just an interesting cast of characters. Here's Rasman playing cards from 1847. Again, part of the River series. These are workers taking a break, playing cards. So kind of what they'd load the boat, and you kind of needed maybe one or two people to steer it because you don't want it to go aground, or you don't want it to run into some rocks or a tree stump sticking out of the water, like they call this a snag. The rest of the guys, though, were just kind of there to hang out until they were needed to load the boat or unload the boat, or maybe take their turns, on watch, so to speak, and things like that. But time to play cards. Here's another one. In a quandary, Mississippi raftsmen at cards. So you can see how they spend their free time playing cards and singing and dancing and all that kind of stuff. Here's another one, watching the cargo. So what happened sometimes is the boats would pull into an area where there might be people living, and it maybe was a chance for them to go into town and maybe buy some supplies, or I don't know, get a meal or a drink or something. But you just can't have everybody leave the boat unattended because all your stuff is on it. So some of the guys would stay behind and keep guards on things, and thus the title of this painting, Watching the Cargo. And then here's one at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Mississippi Boatman from 1850. It's a character study. It's unfortunate we don't know who this gentleman is. Imagine if this was someone's ancestor, like, oh, yeah, that's my great, great, great grandfather, Bill. He was a Mississippi boatman back in 1850. But again, kind of the economic development of this industry and how it affects commerce and transportation and trade and all that kind of stuff. And then later on, 1857, Bingham does another painting of the River Boatman. This is one of his biggest paintings. It's 47 by 70 inches. So, I mean, this painting is 4 feet high and almost 6 feet wide. And by this point in time, the flatboats have been replaced by steamboats and even railroads. So this is kind of almost like a nostalgic look. Because if you think of the Civil War, which would start a few years later, railroads were pretty prevalent by then. So this is just a few years earlier. And so this is maybe almost more like a nostalgic scene than anything. This painting depicts a flatboat docked at a wharf in St. Louis where boatmen amuse themselves with homespun, there's that word that Patti used earlier, entertainment. George Caleb Bingham has organized the crowd in a pyramid, thanks to our friend Pamela's observation earlier, with the smiling dancer waving his red handkerchief at its apex. So here you go.
Another point made in the documentary last night was that he did not typically include people of color in his paintings, and yet in this one, 3 years before or 4 years before the Civil War, he included a black figure.
Yeah, he does right here.
Yeah,
So
he seems slightly. He's not really connected. He's kind of just standing there where everybody else has an activity or is in a pose, like leaning against something.
Mhm.
I thought that was interesting the way they highlighted that in the documentary.
Oh yeah. Let's see. Here's some figures off to the side, and again, really nicely done. And you may be looking at this going, okay, well, these are nice paintings, but what's the big deal? Well, again, there wasn't really anybody else documenting this stuff because they don't have photography, and there's not any other artists really doing anything like this. It's not like I can oh, hey, let me show you all the other paintings of life along the river that were being created at this point in time. Yeah, there were some, but no one kind of the extent of Bingham, or at least the talent of Bingham. And then here's another one in Chicago, kind of a similar one, Jolly Flatboatman. So you're kind of seeing these like similar themes over and over again. And oftentimes these paintings aren't being created for locals in Missouri. They're being packed up and shipped to the East Coast and sold there. That's where the market, I mean, some of them would have stayed in the local area, but these were often made for people back east, so to speak. And if you want a great book about George Caleb Bingham's river paintings, here it is, Navigating the West, George Caleb Bingham and the River. You can check that out. So the River series, an American national identity. Let's see, why don't we start, Brad, with you? Any thoughts on the river paintings? And then we'll go to Harry and Patti before we continue on to the next section, which FY will be country politics.
Trying to get it so I can talk this time. Do you hear me?
Oh yeah, loud and clear.
Well, these paintings are very interesting. They're very full of information if you parse it out, and they're full of some fun. And I was impressed by them.
Oh, thanks, Brad. Appreciate that. What about you, Harry? Any thoughts on the river series before we go on to the next section?
Yeah, a couple things. Somebody asked about the medium, and I think he worked almost exclusively in oil. Although I do think in the movie from yesterday, they mentioned that his early portraits, he was using house paint, just because it was hard to get, the right
Fine materials.
yeah, the materials to work with. And somebody mentioned a certain flatness. I think it's more of the figures look more like statues. Like he does try to show movement, right? But there is a certain stiffness in the structure of the way the bodies are presented, right? And he uses a lot of color, and he's trying to give us a sense of movement, right, with the dancing figure and that kind of thing. But I think, based on his not, having very little formal education, this is a kind of a unique style that he developed in the way, and especially because he did so many portraits to start with, which are like, like you want someone to sit still while you're painting them, right? And so to transition to genre scenes, you have that portrait sensibility, when you do those paintings.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Thanks, Harry. Appreciate that. What about you, Patti? Any final thoughts on the river series before we continue on?
Well, another thing that I keep noticing in his work after the early portraits is the sense of light. It's very different from anything we've seen with Impressionists, but yet his use of light is very important to the whole to the whole effect of these paintings.
Yeah, really, you can, I think for myself, I don't know, I don't necessarily see it right away, but when you start looking at it and processing and thinking about it, oh yeah, you can tell that he incorporates that in a lot of his paintings, the light aspect, which you don't always see, especially from paintings from this era.
And there's a very golden quality to it, which again adds to that sense of ideal,
Yeah, golden quality. That's a good way to put it. So, okay. What about anybody else? Any thoughts?
I was just the other thought I had was, steamboats were coming in at this time, and you saw in that one painting there was a steamboat in the far distance, right, that had run aground. But his focus is really on the flatboats and the men who are participating in that activity. So he doesn't. He's obviously interested in a more sort of nostalgic, um, you know, less machine-oriented view of man interacting with each other, and man interacting with nature, as opposed to incorporating, the steamboats or railroads in any significant, like there might be a steamboat way in the back on that painting. So he's keeping them in the distance.
Yeah, that is an excellent point because you kind of think like, well, why would he do that? I mean, this is like this new technology, and I think it's a little bit different era. But like the Impressionists, there's all these paintings of trains in their paintings because trains were relatively new thing and new technology, and so they really wanted to incorporate that. But you would think like, oh, how come he's not captivated by the railroads and the steamboats and stuff? He is kind of got this kind of like nostalgic sense of kind of documenting what's going on before this way of life passes by.
Yeah, there's that improvisational and temporary message that's conveyed. As we pointed out, I mean, a lot of times these boats, you just sold them, broke them up, whatever, when you got to the end of the river and got home a different way. So there's a lot of temporariness about this whole phase of American history and how people were making their way and making their living.
Right. Okay. All right. Let's continue on. Bingham was a politician at different points in time in his career, and he often painted political scenes. So let's talk about this. This is known as either his country politics series or his election series. And it's basically people going through the democratic process, which is also, of course, very fascinating in terms of the American experience. So George Caleb Bingham, here's another one of his self-portraits he did. He was about 38 or 39 at this point in time in 1849, 1850. He was in the Missouri state legislature. He was elected there in 1848. And throughout his life, he ends up holding several different political offices. He was never like a governor or a congressman, but he was more involved in politics at the local and state level. Here's a painting also from San Francisco, Country Politician from 1849. And these series are really characterized, the paintings in these series, really characterized by Bingham documenting what's known as, say, democracy in action, or how the kind of political process works out in kind of middle America in terms of like country politics. So here you have a candidate and his constituents, and he's out campaigning for local political office. Oops. So here you have a guy and he's giving his spiel to these three gentlemen. I think he's saying, I'm not going to raise taxes, or something along those lines. Here's a close-up. Here's another one, Canvassing for a Vote from 1852. This is at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. If you want to see Bingham's paintings up close in person, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. has some great ones. So does the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But because Bingham's from Missouri, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City and the St. Louis Museum of Art have fabulous collections of his artwork. Again, democracy in action, gentleman campaigning for local office. And then here's one at the St. Louis Art Museum, The Country Election from 1852, featuring local politics. And this has to do with the vote casting process. So sometimes the paintings in Bingham's election series are candidates debating or speaking or talking to constituents, or the vote processing structure, so to speak. So all different types of the democratic process. And one thing that people might not realize if you're not familiar with this era, elections at this point in time were big social events. And so there was food and alcohol and drinking and socializing. It wasn't like today, we just show up at the ballot, place your vote and cast your vote, and then leave ASAP and go about your business. Kind of see all these guys hanging out. Looks like this guy's enjoying the free beverages that are being dispensed. It looks like this guy enjoyed too many of the beverages that were dispensed. Same thing with this guy over here. Here's someone taking an oath. I think what he's doing here is he's swearing that he hasn't voted anywhere else, because of course, you know, the technology back then was not very substantial. And then here's another one, Stump Speaking. This is also at the St. Louis Art Museum. Again, local politics, this time campaigning. This painting actually depicts George Caleb Bingham in the painting. I'll show you in just a moment. So here is actually Bingham over here. He's included himself in this painting. And this is a debate that's taking place. So this gentleman's running for office. He's speaking to the group. And then this gentleman's kind of waiting his turn, taking notes. A candidate leans forward to list his points before a crowd of rural citizens. Behind him sits his opponent, which just so happens to be George Caleb Bingham, with tablet in hand, taking notes for his turn at the makeshift podium. Scholars have used Bingham's drawings to identify individuals in this work. Although many of these figures were recognizable to Missourians, Bingham intended this painting celebrate the democratic election process to more generally for a national audience. And hey, speaking of how this parallels with American history, so the Lincoln-Douglas debates, famous historical series of events that took place. It wasn't when Abraham Lincoln was running for president. It was when he was running for the United States Senate seat from Illinois against Stephen Douglas, and they had a series of debates in 1858. So this is really a great example of life imitating art, because the Lincoln-Douglas debates took place in 1858, and the painting was from 1853, 1854. So wow, imagine that. So it's almost like Bingham is depicting something that would be playing out in real life on an important level just a few years later. Now, of course, they had debates like this all the time in this era, but interesting that he captures this. And here's a close-up of some of the figures. And then the fold. Now, before we get too far ahead, because there's a few more things in this series, this is one of the more well-known works in his election series, as is this one. Anybody have any thoughts or commentary on these two works?
Well, again, it's portraying the process of America inventing itself between one civil war and the next civil war that sort of fixed some other things. But it was in this phase where we were feeling out what it meant to be a democratic republic, the American experiment.
Yeah, which was still a relatively new idea at this point in time.
That's why it was called an experiment.
Yeah, it was not established at all. Okay.
So they're inventing it as they go along.
Okay. Harry and Brad, thoughts?
Well, yeah, one of the things that this painting points out is that there was not a secret ballot, right? That guy is swearing, and then he's going to vote in front of everybody. And so this this made it very difficult to take an opposition position. You know, like if most of the people in your county thought one way and you thought the other, yeah, that made it very difficult for people voting the other way in some cases.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
And the other thing is, you know, there's a very interesting tension here, because you know, the swearing of an oath, that's like a sacred thing, right? Like you're swearing to you know, this is sort of you know, of course it's not church, but it's the most sort of sacred part of the democratic process, right? You making your vote, making your voice known as to what you want to do. But he's got the guy holding up the drunk guy, right? Like he's going to bring him up there so that he can vote, right? And the guy here in you know, sitting down on the side of the painting, you know, getting another drink before or after he voted. So, you know, he's kind of pointing out like, yeah, this is a really important thing, but some people don't take it quite as seriously. And, you know, some of the politicians are involved in supplying those drinks, right? So that they can make sure people vote the way that he thinks they should.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, there is some social commentary going on in that.
And that same social commentary persists in the American consciousness today and is capitalized on regularly.
And you know what's interesting is that if a contemporary artist were going to do some kind of a similar series, you know, even though so much has gone to the internet and television, there are still town hall meetings that take place, and politicians go to diners, right, to talk to people.
Oh yeah, and fast food restaurants,
one-on-one. So you know,
state fairs.
Yeah. So in those days, this was the only way that politics took place for the most part. Now there are myriads of ways that people communicate, but some of this one-on-one interaction still takes place in our time.
Hmm. Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that persists in our consciousness, that this is kind of how we came along. And so there's always that willingness to suspect that there's a lot more going on than we really know.
Hmm. Yeah, and again, a great example of an artist kind of documenting what's going on, because it wasn't for paintings like this. I mean, you would read about this in a book or something, or hear about it in a I don't know, History Channel documentary, but be able to actually see what this looked like, even if it is kind of some partially fictitious rendering, um, is really interesting nonetheless. So, all right, well, let's continue on. He did a
And
few
a
more.
lot of the substance of Mark Twain's social commentary, and who is the guy? Will, you know who I mean, in the 30s.
Farrell
I'm sorry?
Rogers, Will
Yeah.
Farrell, Will Rogers.
This is the like the root of that sort of social commentary that Americans have always loved.
Hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. Great point. Yep, Will Rogers. Here's another famous painting from the election series called The Verdict of the People, St. Louis Art Museum, 1854 to 1855. Again, elections as social events. You notice this one, American flag. And then there's some women here off in the distance. Women weren't voting, uh, most likely at this point in time. And then you also have African-American gentlemen over here. Here's
Who
the
also
full.
weren't voting.
What's that?
Who also weren't voting.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So voting was much more limited at this point in time. And then is this maybe a guy that's also had too much drink? Crowds gather around a courthouse to hear voting results. Everyone is here: the well-to-do, farmers, laborers, merchants, kids, politicians, immigrants, veterans, women, and enslaved African Americans. George Caleb Bingham used his personal experience in the Missouri legislature as inspiration for the election series, which illustrates various stages of the American democratic system, such as political campaigning and the casting of votes. Note his inclusion of the women in the balcony. It's back here. I'll give you a zoom in a minute. And the African American in the left foreground represent two populations without a voice in government at this time. And so, yeah, they're counting the votes and announcing the results. And here's the women over here.
Being kept safe from all that influence.
Yeah, I don't want to get, I've read a common thing was, women don't want to get involved in politics. It's too dirty and all that kind of stuff, so to speak. So interesting in that regard. So there you have it, the election series. Let's see, let's continue on. So Bingham also makes a number of important history paintings, which really kind of help reinforce or shape the national identity. Here's three great examples. Let's talk about these. And these particular three paintings have to do with the American Revolution, Manifest Destiny, and the Civil War. Here's the first one. This is at the Kemper Art Museum in St. Louis. Daniel Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap. This is a painting from 1851 to 1852. This is a really big painting. It's over 4 feet wide. It's what's known as a history painting, which is a work that's documenting some historical event. This is part of the Manifest Destiny, where people are moving west, and America just feels like it's destiny to break out from the eastern part of the continent and go coast to coast. So here you have Boone, and he's leading a group of individuals through the Cumberland Gap. Now, Daniel Boone is an interesting figure in the sense that he plays a really important role in American history, and he was known as an important figure for a really long time. But I do feel like in the last few decades, people have kind of forgotten about him. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Here's Manifest Destiny. Okay, so the United States starts off in the 13 colonies, works its way west, and then eventually people start saying, hey, we should just be content to be over in this eastern part of the U.S. We should have this whole continent from coast to coast, at least in this part of the hemisphere. The Cumberland Gap is a pass within the Appalachian Mountains and near the tri-point of Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, long used by Native American nations. In 1775, Daniel Boone led a team of frontiersmen to widen the path through the Cumberland Gap. to make settlement of Kentucky and Tennessee easier. By the 1790s, the trail that Boone and his men built had been widened to accommodate wagon, making it accessible to pioneers who used it to journey into the western frontiers of Kentucky and Tennessee. And you can actually visit this area. So here's the Cumberland Gap right here. So here's Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And so people are moving. There's this big series of mountains through here. It makes it difficult to travel through here, at least at this point in time. But they could go through the gap and get into fertile Kentucky and Tennessee. And again, so Daniel Boone, he's like a really important guy in American history. In fact, at one point in time, he even had like an own television show about him. I'm guessing that if they were to come out with a television show about Daniel Boone now, that it would be a big dud, because unless it had like, I don't know, Brad Pitt in it or Johnny Depp or something, because I don't have any idea why, but he's just not as popular for whatever reason as he was. But yeah, and this was a well-known television show. It was really popular at the time, but I don't think they would do this anymore for, I don't know why, whatever reason. He's just been kind of forgotten about. And of course, remember Chester Harding, he had done the painting of Daniel Boone that our good friend George Caleb Bingham saw when he was a young man. And then that painting that Bingham saw as a child ended up being the profile photo of Daniel Boone's Wikipedia page. Note here, one of the first folk heroes of the United States, and it talks about the Cumberland Gap, in case you're wondering what Boone's famous. I think a lot of people have heard of Daniel Boone, and they know he was like from the earlier times, but not quite sure what exactly he did or why he's famous. I'm guessing if you had to maybe survey people. Here's the painting again. And then the description of it. The narrative paintings of George Caleb Bingham were influential in crafting political ideologies and popular myths about American national identity in the era of westward expansion. Here, Bingham uses Christian iconography to celebrate Daniel Boone and his explorations of the American West 75 years earlier. Specifically, his entrance into the western territories of Kentucky and Tennessee. Boone is shown emerging with his caravan from a foreboding valley into the dramatic light of the foreground, evoking Moses leading his people towards the promised land. Boone's wife sits prominently atop a white horse. There she is, with a shawl draped around her body and head. The triumphant passage of the group through the landscape with its sublime valley, menacing cliffs, and storm-damaged trees lends further authority to their civilizing mission, symbolically sanctioning westward expansion. All right, so there's the full view of the painting.
Giving some solidity to the whole concept of manifest destiny.
Yeah, exactly. Then they have that triangular composition again. And here's Boone the man. He's leading these people to the promised land. And even the dog is coming along. And then you notice the painting in the sides and the back, it's really dark, but he's coming into the light, so to speak. So interesting fiction there. Let me go through these other history paintings, and then we'll check in with you guys, Harry, Brad, and Patti. This is at the Chrysler Museum of Art, Norfolk, Virginia. I used to live not far from here and visit here all the time. It's a great museum in southeastern Virginia in the Hampton Roads Tidewater area. You get a chance, you should check that out. And this is Washington crossing the Delaware. He actually worked on this painting for several years. He started in 1856. He tweaked it for many years and didn't finish till 1871. It's a depiction of the American Revolution and the important Battle of Trenton, which took place in December of 1776, Washington crossing the Delaware. There's another painting that you've probably seen of the same topic. It was done a few years earlier. So here's Bingham's work. And here is information on this event. So a defining moment in American history. In the months after the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, George Washington's army had been enduring months of defeats and retreats. And then finally, this event took place, a momentum changer, a decisive American military victory that turned the tide of the American Revolution and world history. Washington crossing the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton. And prior to the, oh, go ahead, Patti.
No, this one is very different from the painting that most people think of when they think of a portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware.
Oh yeah, and I'll show that painting in just a minute. And you have to remember the time that this was painted. George Washington was the most famous American before the end of the Civil War, and I don't even know who would be number two. There probably wasn't even a number two. It was like him and then everybody else. And so you could do well by painting George Washington. Here's the more famous depiction of Washington crossing the Delaware that's also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this is also a fabulous painting.
This is the more European version, and the Bingham one is the more American version.
Yeah, and I've heard someone say the one on the left. Well, I like both of these paintings. As I say before, I never try and show these to say that one is better than the other. Just to kind of highlight comparisons and contrast. That being said, both of these are really cool. I heard someone one time say that the one on the left is more the Hollywood version. It wasn't really, like that. That maybe the Bingham one might be a little bit more kind of realistic. Although Washington wasn't astride his horse when he was crossing the river. But it also wasn't like, George Washington was on like the lead boat, with everything going on in the background either. So, okay, there's that term artistic liberties is a real thing. What's that, Patty?
It's our sense of ourselves. On the one side, we were taking on Europe because we were just as good as Europe. And on the Bingham side, we are being American. There's just a different sensibility to the two different portraits.
Oh yeah, and you also have to remember too, as famous as this painting was, it wasn't like the artist made it and then immediately everybody knew about it. I mean, things traveled, information traveled much slower back then. So for him to make this painting, picture someone in Missouri who's never seen that other painting before and has no idea what this event looked like, even if they've heard about it. Like, oh, okay, that's what it was like to be with, Washington when he was crossing the Delaware. That's cool. So, it kind of served its purpose, so to speak. So yeah,
that's what I mean. Like the identity, developing the identity.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a good flatboat in the Bingham painting.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. Thanks, Harry. Appreciate that. Let's see. Oh, if you want to actually see this event, they do a reenactment every year of Washington crossing the Delaware. It's really cool. These are actually what the boats look like. They don't look like the depictions in the paintings. But hey, how would George Caleb Bingham, Missouri, know what these boats looked like that Washington used several years earlier?
Didn't Washington requisition civilian whatever was available? Civilian boats?
Yeah, he basically got these private boats and commandeered them. Let's see. Oops. Oh, if you want to learn more about Washington crossing Delaware, there's this really cool movie called The Crossing, starring Jeff Daniels as George Washington. We've streamed it before, and we're going to do it again on Saturday evening, December 13th, and it's part of our American Revolution 250th anniversary programs we'll be doing in the near future. Let's see. Any more thoughts on? I guess maybe we can take a little bit of a break from me talking, just because these paintings were important. Any thoughts on the Daniel Boone and the Cumberland Gap or George Washington?
Well, Jeff had pointed out that, like me, he gets Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone mixed up. I believe Bess Parker played both characters in different productions, which might be one reason why we can't tell the difference.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, no, that's fair enough.
And it was Davy Crockett supposedly wore the coonskin cap, but you tell me what kind of cap Daniel Boone is wearing in these pictures.
Mm-hmm.
It looks kind of coonskinny to me.
Yeah, I don't know. Good question. Did somebody else have something?
No, just in the Boone painting, looking at it again, I was struck by his wife on the horse wearing the shawl. It's a very it's very much a religious, the idea of Mary and the Pieta, or
Yeah. Very biblical.
Yeah, has a very, it's a very biblical sort of throwback.
Hmm.
And this painting gives me a little bit of a chill because the whole idea of manifest destiny, like, just doesn't strike a good chord with me. And yet this is, like you say, giving it the Bible.
Hmm. Let's see. And then any thoughts on this one?
Well, as I said, this is really the Middle West American version of Washington crossing the Delaware. I'm
Mhm.
sure it was every bit as strong a story in Bingham's time, but like you said, most of these people had not seen more European style art.
Mhm. All right, let's continue on. And then he made another famous historical. Let's see. So Bingham's living in Missouri, and in the years before, during, and after the Civil War, there's all this death and destruction taking place just because of the uh, people debating slavery and kind of related issues to that. These are not Bingham paintings. These are other artists we'll talk about in the future. But Bingham does make a painting. It's at the Cincinnati Art Museum. It's called Order Number 11. They spent a lot of time in the documentary talking about this. That was kind of one of the things that I was not crazy about the documentary, the fact that they spent so much time talking about this. I did like the fact that they talked about it, but it just seemed like they kind of went on and on and on about this one particular painting. And maybe could have went over a few other topics. But anyway, that's my personal opinion. I did really like the documentary. That was my only complaint. This is a big painting. It's 79 inches wide, usually an art scale, oftentimes represents importance. So this is a very important painting by Bingham. And it's a history painting about the Civil War. And so there's all this conflict taking place, again, before, during, and after the Civil War, between pro-slavery and anti-slavery individuals. Things kind of come to a head here. You can see these are some Union soldiers. These are basically the people that are being like kicked out of their house because people had to be cleared from here. This woman here has lost her, I'm assuming that's her husband. Here's some African Americans are kind of turning away. You can smoke in the background from things that have been set on fire. And then you can see General Order Number 11 is the title of the Union Army directive issued during the American Civil War on August 25th, 1863, forcing the abandonment of rural areas in 4 counties in western Missouri. They ordered this because the rebels were kind of running rampant, so to speak, in these areas. So it's kind of a way for them to clear them out. And so it was a controversial topic for Bingham to depict. And then, oops, here's a close-up of the figures on the right. And so, they're bringing their furniture and stuff outside because they have to leave. You just can't leave all your possessions behind. And so that's what's being depicted here. And any thoughts on this one?
I thought it was really interesting in the documentary that one of the curators said, refugees, it's not something you think of in America. And I immediately thought of the founding myth that we most celebrate, the Pilgrims, right? Were refugees. And
Yeah.
from that point on, refugees in America was a constant theme. And yet, we literally do not think of it as refugees. What did we rename those people? Pilgrims. We gave them biblical force. It's just really interesting. It just caught me when she said you don't think of refugees as being an American theme, and I'm like, wait a minute. It's very American.
Yeah, they had to rebrand them. What about Brad and Harry? Any thoughts on this painting?
Well, this painting is kind of important in Bingham's life because it's really his most overtly political statement. And he was pro-union. Somebody asked about how he felt about the Civil War. He was pro-union, but this is a very controversial event where the Union general is bringing the red legging. Those are pro-union guys from Kansas. And of course, the background of this, Missouri was one of the 4 slave states that did not go to the Confederacy, right? They didn't join the Confederacy. So people are very divided. And before the war, the next state over, the next territory over is Kansas. And Kansas becomes the killing ground for pro and anti-slavery people before the Civil War breaks out. So we're looking at an area of the country where there had been violence going back into the 1850s, based on the politics of slavery happening in the Congress. And it's so interesting to me that this is the only Civil War painting that he made, and that he's depicting a scene which is very critical of a decision that a Union general has made. Because he's showing this guy from the Kansas and the Missourians did not like each other, even though they were on the Union supporters were on the same side in the war. And a lot of people felt like the guys with the red leggings from Kansas were like thugs that were brought in to evacuate everybody, so that the rebels wouldn't have any resources. And so now Bingham, they talked in the movie about his house that got used to hold Confederate women that collapsed and a number were killed. And I think he was very bitter about that situation because he hadn't, the Union Army had just taken over his house. And I think his bitterness about stuff that happened before and during the war kind of spilled over into this painting, and a lot of people were very critical of what he had done here because they thought he was a Confederate supporter because he was condemning something that the Union government had done during the war.
Oh yeah,
But
it's like if you're pro-union, how could you possibly challenge anything? Yeah,
criticize,
criticize
yeah, a
anything at
decision
all that
that
the union has done. Shame on
exactly.
you, kind of
And
thing.
he had prints of this made. I mean, he wanted this message to get out. But a lot of his pro-union, friends and contacts really were very critical of him because of this painting. And I think it hampered his ability to, his creative ability later in life.
Oh
That
yeah, it really impacted his commissions that he received later. I mean, I guess a more modern analogy would be like someone making a painting of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and then wondering why people would be so outraged about it. So
yeah.
Well, and this is a central Bill of Rights issue. These people were being deprived of their rights as citizens in the name of the United States of America.
mhm.
And that is such a crux issue that, yes, we have never really dealt well with. We don't do that, but we do when we do it. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Oh
There's
yeah.
that
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the internment camps with the Japanese during
Yeah.
World War II.
there's that constant tension, and it's coming back again. It's here now again.
And
So,
I mean, it's so interesting because it's like, not doing any paintings of railroads or steamboats. This is the only Civil War painting he did, right?
Exactly.
So, but there was a huge amount of violence going on in his part of the country leading up to and during the war, right? So the fact that this was his choice, really says something about how something happened during the war that had a huge impact on him.
oh yeah,
Yes.
because remember, like the Winslow Homer Civil War paintings, they're like soldiers, hanging out in camps and stuff, or even just you don't really see things like this in this era time frame.
Because it's part of our secret pact with each other. We don't talk about this kind of stuff,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
you know?
So, okay, well, let's continue on. So again, history paintings, and then let's look at some of his other works or later works. These are just kind of like a variety of different things that he did later in life.
And they
Um,
were affected by the damage to his reputation. I mean,
yeah,
he was the
oh yeah,
same fault.
he took a huge economic hit. I
Yeah.
mean, before the Civil War, he was actually pretty prosperous. I mean, he wasn't a millionaire, but he was very successful financially. After the Civil War, he really struggled financially. That maybe part of that was changing artistic taste. but also too just the kind of damage to his reputation. But anyway, I like this painting a lot. First, I don't know why, but it's kind of cute. The Mill Boy from 1844. So this was before the Civil War. A young boy taking mill off, or taking grain off to the mill. Here's a portrait of his second wife. So his first wife died in 1848. You might be shocked to see that he remarried the following year. That was pretty commonplace back then, especially if someone had children, because it would be very difficult for someone to raise children by themselves. So you frequently see that.
Hiring somebody.
What's that?
I said
What's
they
that?
didn't want to pay somebody for it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So here's his second wife, Eliza, and a really nice portrait of her. And then this is at my former employer, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the checker players. It's a nice genre scene of country life. You have two gentlemen playing checkers with another person looking on. Oops. And then he did some landscapes. He's not really known as a landscape artist, but he did do some that were really nice, including this one, which is the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, Landscape with Water Wheel and Boy Fishing from 1853. Here's the boy fishing. Here's the water wheel. So really nicely done. So you wouldn't want to typecast him as just the portrait river painting, election series kind of guy. He could do a few other different things. Here's a nice portrait of a young girl that he did later in life. Pretty cool when they know the identities of these people. So this is Miss Annie Allen, 1859, age 6. Here is Major James Rollins. This was the guy that he did the portrait early on in his career. He became friends with him, and then he introduced, Rollins did, to a number of other prominent individuals. He ended up getting a lot of commissions from that. They stayed friends together throughout the rest of their lives. He was a politician and a lawyer.
I think they said in the documentary that he continued to support him even after the controversy.
Oh yeah. Yep. Let's see, here's an interesting one. So later on in his career, he kind of experiments periodically with different things. So this is, if I wasn't familiar that Bingham painted this work, I would have never guessed this was one of his paintings. But that being said, he did this on Thread and Spindle from the Civil War era. And people thought that maybe it was prompted by the birth of his son. Bingham had several children during his lifetime. This is, I think, his best post-Civil War portrait. This is Fanny Smith Crenshaw from 1869. She was the wife of a prominent merchant and businessman. And I just feel like this portrait's really advanced and very skilled. And he did a lot of portraits throughout his career, about 500, including many after the Civil War. But in my opinion, this is one of his best portraits he did during his lifetime. It's got great details, all the intricacies of her clothing. And then some people think this is like a marital portrait, but it's actually a brother and sister portrait. Miss B.W. Clark, Mary Jane Kinney, and her brother. They were from St. Louis. And then here's James Rollins again. Got that cool beard. And here's different portraits of Rollins throughout the years. This one is in a private collection, so the photograph of it is not very good, but I do really like this painting. He did all those of the election series. This one is more of like a legal painting. It's called Puzzled Witness from 1874. And then here's one of his sons.
Oh, named after Rollins.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Patty. Yeah, so I mean, that shows you how close he was to Rollins. He names one of his sons after him. And then Benny Ream was a sculptor based in Washington, D.C. for part of her career. She did sculpture of Lincoln, among others, and she became friends with Bingham. So he did her portrait not once, but twice. And here she is playing some music. And then here's a self-portrait of Bingham. He's age 66 at this point in time. And you'll notice he did this portrait in 1877. He's getting toward the later years of his life because he passed away in 1879. Here he's depicting himself as an artist. He's got pen here and some type of drawing material. And there you have it, George Caleb Bingham, the Missouri artist. So let's do this. Let's go quick review of the work. So we saw the portraits from early in his career. Then we saw the American River series and talked about how that shaped the American national identity. Then we talked about country politics via the election series and the American experience. Talked about history paintings and the American national identity, and then his later work. So why don't we do this? So we'll wrap things up in just a moment. Before we do, let's check in with our, once again, distinguished panel. Brad, why don't we start with you? Any final thoughts on George Caleb Bingham before we call it a night? Oh, let's come back to Brad. Well, Harry, why don't we go with you?
He's not one of the sort of really well-known American artists, right? But I think he really, because of the time period that he's working in and where he's working, he really gives us a like a really interesting look at what was going on in the country in the time that he was working. And, some of those scenes, which, took place before photography for the most part, that we would never sort of understand or appreciate without his work. And the fact that, he was virtually uneducated in art until later in his life, you know, it, he produced really an incredible body of work that there's a lot to appreciate in what he did.
Yeah, I mean, how do we know what things looked like before photography, if nothing else?
I thoroughly agree, Harry.
Um,
To me too, I can't escape this feeling. He seemed like somebody who, despite some hardships in his life, because he lost a lot of people. His father died when he was young. He lost a wife and a son. But he maintained this idealism about the idea of America, and only to have his heart broken at that crucial time, I think. And so I just have this sense of sadness about him that his heart was broken at a crucial time.
oh, that is a really excellent point, Patty, because we didn't discuss it here, but they talked about okay, so he won that one local election, but then he had that taken away from him, and like you said, his father died when he was a young man. He was married 3 times because two of his spouses passed away. Um,
His son died.
children died. Yeah, I mean, this whole thing with the Civil War and his house collapsing. He has all these heartbreaking moments with America, but yet he kind of keeps the faith and kind of continues moving forward, so to speak.
Until that constitutional crisis kind of issue, and that seems to have really broken his spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak.
He does become the first professor of art at the University of Missouri after it's founded. So, he does reach a level of sort of recognition in his career.
Yeah, and then going back to the video that we saw from the Met, where So I'm guessing if you were to talk to someone like, say, 120 years ago, Bingham, like to Harry's point, he's not a super famous artist, but it's not like he's unknown. He was much more obscure up until like it was almost like he was kind of forgotten about because at some point in time, America was like, oh, okay, they were in the Gilded Age, and all this stuff is old fashioned, and they want to move forward, and they're making cars and flying airplanes and get involved in global stuff. And I'm assuming this for a lot of people, this was like too antique and past tense and stuff. So he was not he kind of lost a lot of popularity for a while. It wasn't until maybe the past like 100 or so years he's really been kind of rediscovered.
Yeah,
The
and in
oh,
some ways, those scenes with the small groups, and like on the two men on the riverboat, some of those are very intimate, right? Like you're getting a view of, something that's going on in a small group, like a personal conversation. And some of those paintings are very striking in their ability to communicate across, more than a century of time.
Oh yeah, yeah, documenting things. What about Patty, Brad, Harry? Any final thoughts? Because we'll wrap things up in just a moment.
that's the painting of the two guys playing checkers and the one looking on. Again, I keep associating these paintings with different aspects of things Twain said or wrote, but you could almost see where's the part in Huckleberry Finn where you've got the fraudster that he's a professor or something. It's like you can almost see them, the three of them, there, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah. So you wonder if Twain saw this painting before he invented those people.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a very good question. Good observation. Let's see.
I wonder if Brad's exhausted from all the adventures of the day.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Hey, Brad, any final thoughts on George Caleb Bingham before we call it a night?
No, I think we've pretty well done a pretty good job of covering him. And he's these beautiful river shots, these beautiful home shots, the playing checkers, or I guess it was checkers, didn't look like chess. Pieces weren't big enough.
It was a previous program at the Live Aid, but I forgot to make a joke at the end. I was going to say, all right, well, that was so much fun. Why don't we just start from the beginning and do it over again
Do it
after,
again tomorrow.
after a 2-minute break?
It's been a great day, though, really.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks for all your help. Oh, Harry, one last question for you. I know you said they weren't official, but did you maybe want to once again mention the tours that you might be doing upcoming in the near future?
Well, yeah, just watch the Washington, D.C. History and Culture and the museum and embassy visit sites. And hopefully I'll post something in August and certainly in September for the ending of the Second World War, 80th anniversary. I definitely want to do something then.
Okay. Well, excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that. So let's see. I've been recording this program. I'll post it on our YouTube channel. It might take me a few days to do so. Once I've done that, though, I'll be happy to email out the link. If you're interested in more art and history programs, you can find them on our YouTube channels, which are Washington, D.C. History and Culture and Texas History and Culture. As far as future art programs, I'm currently working like really long hours. And so some of the stuff between now and the end of July, so some of the things that are on the calendar maybe have to change the date. One program I know that's not going to have a date change is this one. So on Thursday evening, July 4th, I was going to do a program about the American collection at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is a really excellent collection of American art, including works by John Singer Sargent here on the left and Frederick Church here on the right. So you can join us for that. And then this was a two-part program. We watched a video about George Caleb Bingham last night, and then today we did the lecture. We're doing a similar setup in September. We're doing the encore of Frederick Remington and the American West We'll see a documentary on him on Friday evening, September 5th, and a lecture on the following night, Saturday, September 6th. This is not completely on our calendar yet, but you can go ahead and note that down, and I'll send the information in the near future. Let's see. One last thing.
Just to clarify, Ellen had asked, I'm pretty sure she meant Harry's, the two things Harry was talking about. Those are not online events, right, Harry?
No, I only do in-person events. So
That's what I thought.
except when I contribute to one of Robert's.
Right. Somebody asked the question.
Well,
I
the
just
book club.
Well, yes, and we have the book club.
Are there any book club events coming up?
So we meet at the second Tuesday of every month at 7. And for August, we're actually going to do something different where we're asking people to watch a movie or a TV series or a documentary and on history, either world history or American history, and be prepared to speak about it. And we'll have some discussion on different, shows that people have watched.
Oh, that's cool. And if someone's interested in that, you can join it virtually. Just Google. Some of you are probably already familiar with the meetup, but if you're not in DC, just Google Washington, DC History and Culture Meetup or Washington, DC History and Culture Book Club or something like that. You can find it. So, all right. Well, thanks for everyone for joining us, especially our panelists. I thought I'd do this. We close out with one last video. This is our preview of our Frederick Remington program. So, oops, hold on.